Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Valentine's Day horror stories. First story: why my wife and I don't celebrate Valentine's Day. As you know, Valentine's Day was yesterday. I wouldn't consider myself exactly the best husband, and certainly not one with utmost memory. I'm not exactly forgetful, and I'm good at remembering anniversaries. But sometimes when you work with criminals all day, things slip past you. This Valentine's was one of them. Years ago, it had never even crossed my mind all day as I sifted through files in the precinct until I was dispatched for investigation of a murder at a love hotel. And as me and my partner ruled it off as a Valentine homicide, which sadly are not uncommon at all. It hit me that my wife left me a love note in my lunch with more endearment, not for nothing, but for today's special day. As I shackled handcuffs around a pimp, my lovely wife was sitting at home, probably with a slice of my favorite red velvet cake, with her hair and makeup done waiting for me to come home. I was glad that the killer committed the crime on impulse and recklessly left behind enough evidence for us to bust down his door and arrest him, not too late into the night. I was starting the ignition by 8 and cruising down to the promenade to pick up a small gift shortly after. It turns out I was becoming more lucky by each passing minute. I got a cheap gift, but it wasn't small. A desperate-looking salesman was vending a kiosk full of cheap flowers and heart-shaped boxes when I spotted the X-amount-foot-tall Teddy slumped next to him. I parked across the street and made my way over with $30 cash, and within no time he was throwing pitches my way in an attempt to reel me in and grab my attention, though it was already his. His greasy hair was slicked back against his shiny head, and the goggle-like glasses made his heterochromatic eyes appear 10 times larger. If I weren't in a hurry, I might be a bit apprehensive, but I was just eager to get home with some attempt of a cheesy and crappy gift to compensate for my lack of effort. I pulled out my wallet and pointed at the bear. "I'll take the life-size Teddy and the hell with it. A dozen of these pink roses." The man shook his head vigorously, his skinny fingers drumming against the surface of the kiosk. I arched a brow. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It's a bit more expensive, and with all due respect, sir, I'm not sure your wife would like such a childish gift." I lied. "It's for my daughter." His face lit up. "Oh, of course. My apologies. Wouldn't want a sad customer?" I rolled my eyes. "So yeah. The roses. And the bear. That'll be all. Thanks, keep the change." He handed me my items and thanked me generously, over and over. I turned around, dragging this large bear behind me with a slight struggle, before I caught him say something under his breath. "I'm sure your daughter would love it." Turns out, my daughter did indeed love the gift. I'd admitted to my wife that it was a last resort, but she simply didn't care. She thought it was incredibly cute. Her words, not mine. It wasn't until the following day where she was not as appreciative. The teddy was sitting tall and hunched over in the living room, not far from the kitchen where we both were getting ready to head out to work, when it began making a clicking noise. We looked at the bear peculiarly before a shutter sound went off, and an illuminating flash blinked from its glossy, strange-looking eyes. We both froze in place, our eyes wide. I don't know why, maybe habit, but I rested my hand on the holster of my gun as I silently crept towards it, telling my wife not to move, though it was my best assumption that she was paralyzed from both shock and fear. The closer I got, the more I stared into those curious, different-looking eyes of its. I saw a lens focus in and zoom on my face as I approached it. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I thought out my options. What would I do? Shoot it if it asked me to say cheese. Shoot a teddy bear right in the stuffing for taking my headshot? I heard the familiar clicking noise, and just as the shutter went off, I hit one of its eyes with the butt of my gun. I hit it again and again and again, in both of its eyes. When I deemed it destroyed, I dragged it over to the couch and flipped it on its stomach to investigate the stitching. "Give me the scissors, will you?" I asked. My wife brought the scissors over, her eyes still wide. I cut the bear open with no hesitation, furiously digging through the stuffing until my fingers curled around a cold, smooth edge. I pulled out the heavy hunk of metal and let it plop on the floor, confirming my suspicions. "Fucking creep," I hissed. "He'd only sell it to me once he knew it was for a kid. That's fucking sick." "Is that A?" asked my wife. I nodded, glaring at the object as if it would break in a million different pieces if I did. "I hope this is the only one he sold. The investigation has since still not been conclusive, and this case was far more extensive than we ever could have imagined or hoped for it to be. Turns out we were dealing with a pedophile, no surprise there, who we would be arresting on charges of child pornography and harassment, i.e., nuisance suit, for the nanny cams. Though his kiosk disappeared, he left us plenty of trails. He owned a surveillance department in town and had installed his own cameras to many of these jumbo teddy bears, and we were able to trace the live feedback to his store. We confiscated every tape and every photograph he'd recorded of so many innocent, oblivious people. No, children. None of them were adults. He only sold for children, except for my case. And he didn't sell just to the children of our city, but all over the states. Because of this, it would be impossible for us to warn every owner. We merely destructed the recording software and made it so that the cameras would be capturing nothing that could be traced except for by the owners. But we did send out several Amber Alerts to every state we could. Word got around and teddy bears became less popular this year. Stuffed animals in general were no longer the ideal gift. I've watched what's on those tapes. None of the other cameras, except for the one in the bear I had purchased, had flashed or clicked or revealed any sign that they were anything other than stuffed bears. My wife and I got lucky. We were the mishap. When ours had been assembled, our suspect over here used a different camera for the first time, as he had admitted in interrogation, and he thought he'd disarmed all of these effects. Luckily for us, and thousands of others from this day forward, he hadn't. It was one simple mistake that ended this horrific tirade. It was obvious he did not work alone, but he wouldn't snitch or give us any other information, so we were forced to just arrest him on the current charges and try our best on the investigation from there. The reason I'm sharing this is because I've seen the return of these bears, and for a cheap price. I've seen some being sold for just $10 at your local Target. And I'm warning you, look very closely into the eyes of your bear. We've since arrested others involved, but I know whoever's behind this grand scheme is still out there. I can't reveal too much, as this case is still open, but what happened with my wife was a fluke. Whoever is in on this sick fiasco is a lot better at hiding a surveillance camera in a teddy bear. My wife and I have since decided that Valentine's Day is not a day we should consider in our agenda. It's not even a real holiday. It's just a scheme to get you to spend your money on chocolates and flowers and fancy dinner dates. And sometimes, like in this case, a salesman will abuse this opportunity for his own selfish needs. I just wish for most, what they want is money and not the latter. Like this one had. Second story. My childhood boyfriend drowned when I was 15, and I have received a rose at my doorstep every Valentine's Day since. This time of year is always hard for me. 10 years ago, on February 13th, my boyfriend went missing. His body was found washed up on the edge of the river bank the next day. Matt and I had been dating for 3 years, and it would have been 3 years on Valentine's Day. He was sweet and mature, unlike a lot of the boys at our school. I remember that first Valentine's Day. He wrote me a poem in a handmade card and left it with a single rose on my desk. It had a question at the bottom. Will you be mine? I, of course, said yes. How could I say no? I know this sounds silly looking back, considering we were so young, but we made big plans for our future. I couldn't see any other reality than us being together. He and his family lived just around the corner from mine, and we often sneaked out to our local park. The nights we spent planning every detail of our future under the stars were magical. My world began to fall apart when I got home from school one night. I had been worrying all day that I hadn't heard from Matt and thought it was unusual that he hadn't at least texted me. As I walked through my front door, there was a man and woman sitting in our living room. My parents were with them, and I could see in my mother's teary, red-rimmed eyes that something bad had happened. The evening and the next day were a blur as the two detectives explained how Matt was missing, then how they found his lifeless body in the frozen river the next day. My Valentine's Day was spent alone drowning in my own tears. That was until there was a knock on the door around 8 p.m. that day. My dad opened the door to find a single rose. It had a small note attached that read, "Amy, I love you." When my father handed me the freshly cut rose and the small note, my heart dropped as I knew it was from Matt. Part of me even refused to believe he was gone, but the subsequent funeral and memorials made me face reality, even if it hit me like a freight train. I still had a shred of hope. I didn't go to school for a few weeks after. I just couldn't face it. The questions, the staring, it was all too much. Reliving this now still pains my heart. A year had nearly passed, and even though I had started smiling and going out with friends again, the scars still ran deep. There was a small anniversary memorial for family and close friends, and Matt's family was equally supportive of me as I was of them. After I got home from the memorial, I found a single rose delicately placed on our doormat. My stomach dropped as I noticed the same handwritten note was attached. My parents were slightly concerned, but I didn't feel any malice or creepiness. I knew it was from him. As I placed the rose in a small vase of water and put it in the center of my windowsill, I smiled as a tear ran down my face. As the years went on, I kept this tradition, and the single rose was always at my door each Valentine's Day. I know that this sounds like a sick, twisted joke from someone taking advantage of the tragedy, but in my mind, it was a small sign from Matt. In that moment, I felt his love once again. 5 years later, I met my soon-to-be husband, Luke. He was aware of my past struggles with relationships, but he was patient and understanding. I knew he was the one for me, and we got married 2 years ago. We moved into our first house that summer after living in a rental apartment. However, the annual rose and note continued to follow me, causing tension between Luke and me. He believed that someone was playing a cruel joke on me, but I had a different view. On last Valentine's Day, Luke threw the rose and note away, as he said he didn't like the fact some creep was sending me these kind of things. This led to a heated argument that resulted in me crying myself to sleep while he slept on the couch. The next day, I found a crushed, decaying rose. It had a broken heart hand drawn on the attached note in my mailbox. I held it in my shaking hand as I went inside. I broke down as I placed the remains of our flower and heartbreaking note in my bedside table. In the following months after, strange things began to occur in our house. The TV would turn on in the middle of the night, cupboards would open themselves while we were at work, and footsteps were heard at night outside on the decking. Luke decided he would install cameras outside, but they showed nothing. That was until last week. The backyard camera captured a shadowy dark figure moving across the outside wall by our back door one night. Luke told me that the security app alerted him at 2:25 a.m. He then got out of bed and went to check no one had broken in. As he walked into the kitchen, Suddenly the lights began to buzz and flicker above him. He then felt a sharp pain as something scratched down his bare back. I came running downstairs to check on him after I heard his pain-induced cry. I saw 5 deep red scratches run down his back. After I had cleaned his wounds and we had calmed down a bit, we went back to bed. I watched the footage back the next morning, and it indeed captured the looming shadowy figure outside. That's when I noticed it was holding a flower. It was the silhouette of a rose. The grief and guilt I felt in that moment was incomprehensible. How Matt was still trying to show his love for me from beyond the grave, and I had moved on and shut him out. I now feel terrified on what may happen to me or Luke this upcoming Valentine's Day. Third story. A random woman on the street gave me a Valentine's Day card. I wish I hadn't opened it. It read, "Will you be mine?" There was no name, no one to whom it had originally addressed, just a crumpled red envelope and a mostly blank white card, with the aforementioned question written inside on the right. The black ink had smeared, either at the time of writing or sometime during its travels through the curious woman's pocket. It somehow made the question seem sad, desperate. She gave me one last glance, then stepped away, mingling with the crowd that seemed to appear from out of nowhere at that very moment. I didn't know what to do, and had anyone else given it to me, I probably would have tossed it. But the woman had been strangely, unconventionally attractive, so I kept it. I used it to buoy my spirits after what had been a particularly frustrating day at work. She could have given it to anyone, but she'd chosen me. Back home, I set it on the kitchen counter and started to make myself something to eat. A few minutes into dinner preparations, I got this feeling in the back of my neck, like there was someone watching me. Turning around, I scanned my small apartment, able to see the entirety of the kitchen and the living room beyond from where I was standing at the stove. There wasn't anyone in sight, and yet I still felt as if I were being observed. It was around 8 p.m. Night had already set in, but my living room curtains were still open. I crossed the room, closed them, and returned to the kitchen. The ominous feeling lingered, but I ignored it and finished cooking. Halfway through eating dinner, there was a knock at the door. I'd never had anyone stop by to visit before, so the occurrence was at once alarming. I sat there, frozen mid-chew, hoping that there'd been some kind of mistake, but another knock came. Rising from the table, I gripped my fork in my hand and crept toward the front door, trying not to announce my occupancy of the apartment. Reaching the door, I peered through the peephole, not exactly dreading what I'd see, but hoping not to see anyone. My hope panned out. There wasn't anyone there. And yet this unnerved me because I hadn't heard any departing footsteps. Carefully, fork gripped tightly in my right hand, I opened the door an inch. No one occupied the space beyond, so I opened it all the way. The threshold was empty. Both ends of the hall were empty. I didn't notice the evidence that anyone had even been there until I took a tentative step into the hall. Turning around to re-enter my apartment, I saw that someone had written something on the door. An unsettlingly familiar phrase, "Will you be my mine?" And just like the ink in the card, the writing, dark paint, I hoped, was smeared, the letter E in mine no more than a trailing blot. I hurried back inside and slammed the door. My heart was going crazy. I sensed that something was happening, that I was being subjected to some kind of prank or harassment. I had to hold onto the wall as I made my way back to the kitchen, my anxiety making my steps unsteady. As I returned to my seat at the table, my appetite utterly lost, I was suddenly beset with the urge to look at the card again, to read it again, even though I knew what was written inside. I went over, grabbed it from the counter, and sat back down at it, shoving my unwanted dinner aside. I withdrew the card from its envelope and set it on the table, a feeling of mounting unrest making my hands tremble. The blank white face of the card seemed to augur some terrible yet unguessable news, an infinite array of cryptic possibilities. Finally, I willed my hands to open the card. Inside, written on every single inch of space, was the phrase, "Will you be mine?" Over and over, in every direction, some instances more erratic than others, there was a terrible and terrifying variety to the scribblings. I'd never felt more disturbed by such a relatively simple thing. Will you be mine? Will you be mine? Will you be mine? I threw the card away. But after a few moments spent on the couch trying to calm myself, I got up, fetched my candle lighter, and burned the card in the kitchen sink. As the flames consumed it, crumpling and blackening the material, I felt a new sensation, not exactly nausea, but a bodily lightness. I gripped the counter, attempting to steady myself. It wasn't until I had practically keeled over that I noticed the fumes weren't gray or black or the color of any smoke I'd seen before, but red as the envelope the card had been in. Consciousness began to ebb away just as I heard the front door open. I remembered then that I hadn't locked the door. I'd merely slammed it in my panic. You idiot, I thought to myself as darkness took me. I awoke on my kitchen table, and the first thing I noticed was the chill. I was naked, had been stripped completely. Given the circumstances, as terrible as they were, I expected to be bound, but I was not, and promptly rolled off the table when I shifted my weight. I landed hard on my shoulder and briefly hoped that I'd pass out again, if only to stop the flare of pain. Recovering, using the table for leverage, I stood up. My senses were rekindled completely when I saw what was smeared on the table's surface. It was, unmistakably, blood. My blood. As if activated by the sight, my nerves exploded and pain coursed down the front of my body. I fell to my knees, my body overwrought with agony. With one eye open, the other closed, as if that had somehow mollified the pain, I examined myself. From the top of my chest all the way down to my groin was the word mine, carved into my skin, as erratically as the darkly enigmatic question in the card. It was like I had been claimed, the word lacking a question mark, the wounds still fresh, a grisly statement of ownership. Every movement, no matter how subtle, brought a new spike of breath-stealing pain, so I just stayed there, kneeling on my kitchen floor, as errant streams of blood trickled from the wounds that had not yet coagulated. My one attempt to call for help brought so much pain that I almost fainted, so I refrained from doing even that, not wanting to bleed out while unconscious. I stayed like that for over an hour, until my body had grown somewhat accustomed to the debilitation. Then I stood, cringing against the only slightly diminished agony and shedding no small number of tears, and called the police. They came, I was taken to the hospital, and they investigated what they could of my apartment and the evidence therein. I've yet to hear any news of a lead or idea of the perpetrator. They've only informed me that the card, the one I'd burned, had been taken into evidence. I was shocked at this, and it must have shown on my face because the officer asked if something was wrong. I asked him how they had recovered the card, given what I'd done, and he said that there wasn't anything wrong with it, that the alleged fire hadn't damaged it at all. An itch in the back of my mind compelled me to ask him another question, even as I grappled to comprehend what he'd told me. What did the card say inside? The officer met my eyes for a moment, a look of slight bewilderment on his face. It said, "I'm glad you're mine. Once I'm well enough to leave the hospital, I'm finding a new place to live. The landlord can have everything in my apartment. I'm never going back there. For the first time in my life, I'm happy I'll be spending Valentine's Day alone." Fourth story. Lonely and terrifying Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day used to be a challenging day for me as a long-term single individual. Each year, it served as a stark reminder of my solitude. However, this year, I opted for a new approach. I learned about a Valentine's Day gathering for singles occurring in my area and decided to check it out. Upon arriving at the event, I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of attendees. A diverse group of singles all seeking romance. I engaged in conversations with a few individuals, but none of them piqued my interest. As the night wore on, I began to feel more and more like an outsider. It seemed as though everyone was hitting it off, except for me. Then, I spotted her. She was standing alone in the corner, much like I was. I approached her and initiated a conversation. We hit it off instantly, and before I knew it, the night had flown by. As the gathering drew to a close, we exchanged contact information and arranged to meet up for a second date. Our second date was even better than the first. We went out to a nice restaurant and had a great time talking and laughing. She was smart, funny, and beautiful. I felt like I had finally found someone I could really connect with. After dinner, we went back to her place. We talked some more, and then things started to get intimate. It was passionate and intense, and we were both really into it. But then something strange happened. She started acting a little off, like she was someone else. She was saying things that didn't make sense, and her voice even sounded different. I tried to shake it off and continue, but it just got weirder and weirder. Eventually, I realized that this wasn't the woman I had gone out with. It was like she had been possessed by something. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was like we were trapped in there together. She kept getting more and more aggressive, and I knew I had to do something. I managed to break a window and climb out. As I ran away, I could hear her screaming behind me. I didn't look back until I was far enough away that I knew she couldn't follow me. When I finally looked back, I saw her standing in the window, staring at me with eyes that weren't her own. I knew then that I had narrowly escaped a truly terrifying Valentine's Day. The following days after my terrifying encounter with my possessed date, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that lingered within me. I tried to move on and forget about what happened, but I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the real woman I had met. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself feeling increasingly paranoid. I started noticing strange occurrences happening around me, things that couldn't be explained logically. Objects moved by themselves, doors would creak open and close on their own, and I would hear whispers and strange noises in the middle of the night. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard a faint tapping at my window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch, but then it started getting louder and more persistent. I got up and cautiously approached the window, only to be greeted by a chilling sight. There, standing on my front lawn, was my possessed date. Her eyes were pitch black, and she had a twisted smile on her face. I quickly closed the curtains and retreated back to my bed, feeling more terrified than ever before. I couldn't explain what was happening to me, but I knew that I was in grave danger. The next day, I decided to seek help from a spiritual medium. She performed a cleansing ritual on me, and I finally found some relief from the strange occurrences that had been happening around me. She explained that my date had been possessed by a powerful and malevolent spirit that was attracted to my loneliness and vulnerability. Fifth story. Mr. George the Gorge's Valentine's Day Special. The children shrilled with laughter as Mr. George's belt shook the stage. The stench of rotten fruit lingered, evidence of the 265 candy apples he had just consumed. He rubbed his gelatinous belly, his snout curling into a smile. "Oh ho ho!" he squeaked, his cherubic pitch betraying his 8-foot frame. "Your Valentine's gifts were so scrumptious today. Thank you, everyone." "You're welcome, Mr. George," the audience roared. I winced from stage left, the noise having interrupted me from reviewing my routine. I glanced at the two people before me and the two behind. 3 new faces, 4 frowns. I maintained my smile and returned to rehearsing my words. "We've had such fun today, everyone," Mr. George continued, slapping his hands together. Our show's almost over, which means Mr. George's fun friend time. The showman chuckled, his jawbreaker eyes rolling in their sockets. That's right. And for today's special, I've asked all my friends to share why Valentine's Day is so super duper great. As he swung one arm to the adults, Smarties, Skittles, and M skittered across the stage from his candy-scaled skin. A spotlight veered to the first act, an unkempt man who cowered in the light. A cloaked stagehand pushed him forward, the light following. Say hello to my new friend, Mr. Stewart. The children cheered, their spittle spraying the edge of the stage. The man flinched. Mr. George squelched 2 steps toward the man, leaving pudding footprints behind. Mr. Stewart, he squealed. What the hell's going on? The man cried. He looked at his fellow guests. Is this a joke? What the fuck is this? He searched for cameramen, producers, someone who could be running the show. I'm done. Let me leave. The children were quiet, their silhouettes motionless. I steeled my smile. The man took a step back. A stagehand tackled the man from behind, propelling him into Mr. George's outstretched arms. The showman clamped his hands on each side of the man, his hands spanning from shoulder to elbow. Ah, Mr. George trilled. It seems like Mr. Stewart needs love. That's right. Get ready, Mr. Stewart. Mr. George creaked and snapped as his snout opened, revealing hundreds of candy corn teeth. The beast leaned forward, holding the man's face inches from his maw, and vomited. Red candy coating engulfed the man as he shrieked and struggled. The sour odor of burnt flesh, sulfur, and cinnamon coming led with the sound of children's laughter. When Mr. George let go, Mr. Stewart's candied body collapsed against the concrete flooring. His corpse would harden from the coating before it would from rigor mortis. Oh, that Mr. Stewart was such a party pooper. Let's hope our next friend is more playful. Mr. George danced on stage, gesturing toward the next act. You may remember her from our last show. It's Miss Sandy. He performed a stomping tap dance before turning to her. Miss Sandy, why is Valentine's Day special for you? The spotlight blanched the woman's face. She clutched at her cue card. I was with her in the last show, and her response had saved me from performing. I appreciated that. However, I knew from her look it wouldn't happen again. Her look was the look of someone whose plan had fallen through. I have seen it many times before. She tiptoed forward, her voice shaky as she spoke. Valentine's Day is special to me because it is the day you show us your... Her breath hitched. Mercy. She choked again. And love. Mr. George's smile widened, splitting at the edge of his lips. You need love, too, Miss Sandy? No, she shouted, shaking her head. No, that's okay. I don't need any, Mr. George. She stumbled backwards. She hesitated before turning to run. A licorice tongue cracked against the woman's back before wrapping around her. She screamed for help as she was whipped back toward Mr. George. She collided with his body, sinking into his stomach and chest. She struggled to break free. Mr. George's tongue swiped across her face as it retracted, covering her mouth with a jelly film to stop her cries. The children jumped in their seats and clapped. The showman twirled and bowed. You did need love, Miss Sandy. It feels so good to have you with me. And you're right. I do love to show my love on Valentine's Day. I stifled a grimace as the woman looked pleadingly toward me. I could not think of her now, especially with the spotlight on me. I beamed toward the audience. That's 2 friends now. 3 to go. Mr. George crowed, lumbering back into a dance. I'm so happy to welcome Mr. Phil Friendship for his 5th show. It was time. I jigged forward, clapping my hands while guffawing. As you can see, Mr. George, I called while cartwheeling. I'm so happy to be here today. I somersaulted onto my feet and began mimicking Mr. George's dancing. The children bellowed from their seats, their smiles frothing. The room quieted quickly once Mr. George spoke. "Oh ho ho, you're so silly, Mr. Friendship. But what, I wonder, is your answer today?" I froze in place with my mouth agape, feigning surprise. "Oh." I jumped into an upright posture. "Oh." My answer. "Well, I love all of the love on Valentine's Day, just like you. It makes me and you all warm and fuzzy. Isn't that right, Mr. George?" I didn't wait for an answer. It was too dangerous. "But you know, Mr. George, why do we get all the love today? You've been loving on us this entire show. Now it's our turn to love on you. Isn't that right, kids?" I reached to the audience. Yes, they erupted in unison, convulsing in their seats. But they didn't move further. Despite how they writhed, they waited for Mr. George. I felt the sweat trickle down my back and from my armpits. I kept my arms before me and clenched my smile tighter. The monster stood still, his eyes twirling. The showman hummed, his voice deep and rumbling. It reverberated throughout the stage, making the other two acts yelp. I blinked the water away from my eyes. Minutes seemed to pass. Ah, shucks. Mr. George hooted, the high pitch returning. "You're right, Mr. Friendship. Come on, kids. Show me how much you love me." I scurried off stage as the children stampeded on stage. I hurtled myself in a steel cage in the wing, locking the door behind me. I sobbed as I watched from the narrow grill. The children had swarmed Mr. George, who giggled unceasingly. They tore chunks off of his body and bit into his flesh. They ripped apart Miss Sandy and opened the showman's stomach. They tugged at taffy intestines and rock candy ribs. Candy bile coated and dissolved their hands, which, in turn, were eaten by themselves or other children. Some kids feasted on Mr. Stewart. Two scratched at each other's faces as they fought over an arm. One child gnawed on another's leg, seemingly unfazed by the lack of sugar. Other children had pursued the two other side acts into the auditorium, stifling their screams in hungry mouths. I assured myself there had been no time to tell them this would happen. Even the stagehands had known to flee immediately. As bloodied fingers clawed through the grill of my cage, I sat against the opposite wall, my hands against my ears. More would come before the end of the night, but they couldn't get me. As long as I stayed in this cage, they couldn't get me. If I could sleep, it would be over more quickly. I focused on the sound of my heartbeat, hoping it would drown out the animalistic howls around me. Asterisk. When I woke, I found myself on my bedroom floor, just like the 4 times before. There was no doubt about last night's events. The tie-dye jumpsuit I was still wearing reeked of dry sweat and urine. The next show would not be for another week, allowing time for Mr. George to reform and new friends to be gathered. I had that long to devise new routines. Phil Friendship needed to continue winning the audience's adoration, and I don't know how long they will embrace him as a guest star. I try to avoid thinking about it. 6th story. The toxicity of couples on Valentine's Day needs to end. They sat at a table not far from mine. The diner was practically empty, not exactly a prime location for romantic dates with its grease-slick floors and ever-present aroma of burnt bacon. And yet they'd seated themselves at the table immediately to my left, as if they needed an audience for their public displays of affection. I had already ordered, so I kept my face down and ate my breakfast bowl in peace. But every so often I'd hear them loudly professing their love for another and giggling and making all manner of needlessly performative gestures. It bordered on perverse, so I eventually looked pointedly at them with what I hoped was a silencing glare. I was just trying to eat my lunch in peace. The woman noticed my look, and in misinterpretation or defiance of the intended effect, smiled at me. The man, seeing her attention elsewhere, turned, and he too smiled. Their flippant responses would have angered me had I not noticed the oddness of their expressions. The smiles weren't impolite, not exactly, but there was something beneath them, an underlying impression or intimation of hostility, one that was far more potent than what I'd added to my glare. Just then my waitress came over with a pot of coffee. I extended my mug, happy to have the awkward interaction with the couple interrupted. When the waitress left, I saw that the couple had resumed their obnoxious snogging. Too tired to re-engage, just wanting to finish my meal and go home, I quickly ate my eggs and drained my mug. As I was walking past the couple to pay at the counter, I overheard the woman mention something about loners, and I was immediately sure that she was talking about me. I stopped in my tracks and glared at her, though this time she ignored me, even though I was standing only a few feet away. The man then laughed, either in response to the woman's comment or at my admittedly weird posturing. I wasn't actually going to do anything, merely wanted them to know that I'd overheard. The waitress, perhaps seeing the interaction and wanting to avoid trouble, called over to me, asking if I was ready to pay. I nodded and turned away from the gossiping lovers. I paid, tipping a little more than usual for having nearly caused a scene, even though I felt that the couple were the ones ultimately responsible. Before I could step out the door, I heard someone call out, "Hey, you." Turning, I saw that it had been the woman, who was rising from her table. She came over to me and asked, "We saw that you were alone. You don't have to be, not today. You're free to come with us, if you'd like. We're just going around town, enjoying the day." I was surprised, not just by the offer, but by the woman's beauty, which I had apparently failed to notice in my agitation. It was almost discomforting, like staring into an exceptionally bright light. Her features were starkly refined yet relaxed, her eyes piercing, as if she had never once felt anything but total confidence in any given social situation. It was obvious that I couldn't refuse, so I meekly nodded, and as if sensing my response, he'd been facing the other way, the man rose from his seat and joined us. He paid for their meal and the three of us left together. Luckily, I hadn't made any other plans for the day. Otherwise, I would have abandoned them without hesitation, regardless of with whom they'd been. The three of us spent a few hours walking around town, exploring different shops and buying a few items here and there. I learned that they were visitors, had come from somewhere in old Europe, a phrase whose meaning I couldn't exactly discern, but accepted nonetheless. Aside from that, they said very little about themselves, and instead questioned me on my life, specifically why I was alone on Valentine's Day. Naturally, I felt embarrassed by the question, and offered the simple though undoubtedly unconvicting response that I'd never felt the need to find a date just to celebrate the holiday. I was given the appropriate, "That's fair," response, and the subject was promptly dropped, but the woman would occasionally point out random women and ask how I felt about them, if I found them beautiful, and the man would laugh. There was nothing mocking about it. I sensed none of the smoldering animosity I'd seen in their gazes back at the diner. Things were still awkward, but no more so than you'd expect in such strange circumstances. Things took a turn for the worse when we entered a bookstore. There were, understandably, plenty of couples browsing the shelves and occupying the tables at the attached cafe. My companions quickly fell into form, grabbing cups of coffee and wandering through the aisles. Since I'd had a couple cups back at the diner, I chose to forego more caffeine and instead followed casually behind them whilst trying not to appear as some pathetic third wheel. It took a few moments for me to notice, but eventually I realized that we were slowly meandering through the sections concerned with history, mythology, and ancient cultures, specifically those of a European nature. I remembered then what they had said of their origins and tried to pay close attention to where their attention lingered, so that I could figure out their exact heritage. But before I could deduce anything definite, The man turned to me and said, "You know, while this is all interesting and informative from a general perspective, there really isn't anything here that'll tell you the full truth of us. You know." I had no idea what he was talking about, so I replied, "What do you mean?" He smiled, and while the expression was outwardly friendly, I again perceived a subtler, darker meaning behind what now seemed like a superficial mask of friendliness. At that moment, my heart rate quickened a little, and as if overhearing it, the man looked down at my chest. And for the briefest second, the face beneath appeared, a once dormant malice flaring to the surface. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was demonic, but there was a certain inhumanity about it, and I instinctively backed away. The bookshelf behind me stopped my progress, and panic seized my limbs. But the man's face relaxed, and his smile became no more threatening than that of a mischievous friend. "Are you all right?" There was no ironic or ulterior inflection to the question, but I nonetheless felt compelled to answer in the affirmative. "I'm fine. Yeah." I couldn't stop my heart from going haywire, but the man diverted his eyes from my chest to meet my gaze. He nodded and beckoned for me to follow him. We caught up to his partner, who had wandered over to the horror section. There, she'd apparently found something of interest to her. She was engrossed in a book of old supernatural tales. The man went and stood behind her, placing his hands on her hips and peering over her shoulder. Every few moments they would chuckle together. Curious, I ventured a little closer and peered at the open pages. I vaguely recognized the story as a tale about old blood drinkers, not exactly vampires, but something similar, more feral, having none of the pomp and aristocratic heritage commonly associated with the mythic horrors. After a while, they closed the book and wandered off, and I followed, somehow knowing that they expected me to. They went toward an area of the bookstore that was under renovation. The section, which had apparently held magazines and book-related trinkets, was cordoned off by tape, the accompanying walls bare and repainted. The area was around a corner, away from the main flow of the foot traffic. As the couple rounded this corner, I felt an alarm go off in my head, a dim animal warning not to follow them. But another impulse, one that felt like it had been implanted, suppressed that seemingly primal trepidation, and I went around. I still can't figure out how they managed to transform so quickly. In the 5 or 6 seconds it took me to join them, they'd turned into something else, something both less and more than human, older than mankind, yet somehow more evolved, more refined in savagery. They were alike in general appearance, though the woman had retained her female characteristics and the man his. Their bodies had broadened, becoming nearly as wide as the bookshelves we'd left behind. Their eyes had parted further, resting now at their temples, giving them a weird, fish-like appearance above their now pointed noses. Their skulls had expanded, ballooning to a size and shape that was nauseating in its unwholesomeness. The once blonde hair on both their heads had inexplicably grayed, now hanging in withered clumps from their irregularly lumpy scalps. With bestially arched backs and hunched shoulders, they stood like proto-men, but their narrow-eyed expressions bespoke of a callous intellect. Their clothes, taut in some places, loose in others, bore fresh bloodstains, as if the transformation had caused their skin to burst or tear. They were awful, abominable things, and yet I couldn't even so much as turn away. I was awestruck, terror-stricken. I knew then that from the moment they'd laid eyes on me, I'd been under their monstrous thraldom. No one should be alone on this day. They spoke in unison, with voices that might have belonged to a reclusive crypt-keeper, if not the dead he kept. The woman's mouth, which, somehow, had become utterly lipless, opened, and from out of it came a long, red-veined flesh tube, like an insect's proboscis. I watched, horrified, as it snaked its way through the air toward me. Unable to even move, I could do nothing but whimper sheepishly as the appendage touched my neck. Remembering the book they'd laughed at, I mustered the courage to beg them not to drink my blood, assuming that they were some horrid precursors of vampires. They laughed, the woman accomplishing this despite the long tube extending from her mouth, and the sound sent a stifling chill down my spine, silencing me. The man, with his ungodly face, smiled and said, "Dear, could you imagine if we drank blood? If we needed to subsist on that vile stuff?" The woman, with her tubular tongue still dancing around my neck, replied, "Oh, I'd just give it all up. What a dreadful life that'd be." They let loose another round of that hoarse, ghoulish laughter, and my soul shrank. "No, I'm not going to drink your blood, child. I'm going to give you some of mine." Just then, there was a stabbing pain in my neck, and the tube went rigid right to the woman's mouth. There was a pulsing sensation, and I felt something being steadily pumped into me. I swooned as if suddenly and deeply intoxicated. Something foreign was coursing through my veins, paradoxically chilling and warming me. I at once felt feverish, drunk, physiologically unstable. Eventually, the proboscis was withdrawn. The woman slurped it back into her mouth like some vein-streaked noodle. My legs gave way, and I hit the floor just as their detransformation began. I was gently shaken awake by an employee of the bookstore. Their face was full of concern, and I saw that they dialed 911 on their phone, though hadn't yet called. Still a bit dazed, I looked around for the nightmare couple, but saw only a small crowd of concerned customers. Wanting to believe that it had all been some kind of fever daydream, I assured everyone that I was fine, and let the bookstore employee help me stand. I thanked them and hurriedly left, finally listening to that lizard-brain warning to get out of there. When I got home, I examined myself in the mirror. I didn't bother wiping away the subsequent tears. I had, after all, been stabbed or violently probed with something. There was a red puncture wound in my neck, rimmed with a weird purplish ring from which trailed similarly colored streaks, like some kind of bizarre bacterial infection or toxin. It's been 3 hours since confirming the wound, and I've started hearing her voice in my head. She calls to me, across a distance that seems both vast and close, offering words of comfort and praise, sometimes sounding like a mother, other times like a lover. And a certain feeling of affection has blossomed in my heart, a longing for a companionship whose nature feels disturbingly inhuman. I don't even know her name. They never told me, and I for whatever reason never bothered to ask. And yet I'm starting to think that I love her, that I need her, and that she feels the same way about me. I have always felt alone and bitter on Valentine's Day. I don't feel that way anymore. 7th story. A girl asked me out for Valentine's Day. You still haven't told me why you asked me out for Valentine's Day. I reminded Kyrie. Don't worry. She smirked. If you haven't figured it out by the end of the night, I'll tell you. Her gloved fingers slid between mine, and she gave my hand a little squeeze. I couldn't believe this was happening. I'd had a crush on Kyrie since the moment we met. Even though she'd shown up at my apartment with a guy I couldn't stand. Johnny was my roommate's best friend. He and his crew only ever showed up after midnight, drunk, high, and looking for trouble. Things were always broken or missing in the morning, but my roommate Nate refused to control his friends. The night I met Kyrie, I woke to the sound of drunken giggles and the apartment door slamming open. "What are you just standing out there for?" a slurred voice shouted. "Come on in. It's cold." I groaned. "Johnny." In the main room, I could see my roommate Nate leaning boozily against the wall. A big blonde girl tried to dance on our coffee table and kicked a hole in it. Meanwhile, Johnny was ranting about a band he hated and preparing a line of coke on a handheld mirror. Blood rushed to my head. I was shoving my way toward him before I had time to think. My parents had struggled with addiction all their lives, and a dirty needle had been my mother's death sentence. I didn't want to see that stuff, didn't want it in my home, where I lived. Put that away. Get it out of here. I snapped. Come on, man. It's my party fuel. Don't like it? Go back to bed. Johnny sneered. A short girl with frizzy brown hair watched me carefully. It's his house, Johnny. His rules. The girl rolled her eyes. Don't like it? Get your own place instead of mooching off of Nate all the time. Johnny turned red and glared at me, but he also put the Coke away. Kyrie introduced herself, but I can't remember anything about the conversation. I was too focused on her dark hazel eyes and how my heart was racing in my chest. After the party, she did something none of Johnny's friends had ever done. She stayed to help clean up. By the way, Kyrie asked, wiping a red Jell-O shot off of the counter, what are you doing for Valentine's Day? Well, it's a Tuesday, so probably work and then the gym. I laughed, then started rambling. I couldn't help myself. I mean, I'm sure I'll end up getting on a dating app or going to a bar, because nothing's worse than sitting at home alone on Valentine's Day. How about I pick you up at 8? Kyrie asked. My jaw dropped. At some point I must have nodded, because here I was, on my first date of the new year. If it was a date, even when we walked hand in hand into the ice skating rink, I wasn't completely sure what I was doing here. Unsurprisingly, the skating rink was packed with couples. Some twirled, others stumbled, but as we laced up our skates, Kyrie pointed to a young man and a 5-year-old child. Look at those two. What do you see? She whispered to me. A single dad, I guess? I grasped for more details. The handsome young man held the boy's hand, teaching him. They're both struggling, so I guess it's their first time here. And judging from the way he keeps looking around and checking his watch, he's probably meeting somebody here. You notice things. Kyrie raised an eyebrow, impressed. That's one of the things I like about you. Keep watching. We made our way onto the ice. I did my best to keep an eye on the pair in the sea of skaters. A strikingly beautiful woman with raven hair stepped effortlessly onto the ice, all smiles. The man grinned and waved. His date was here. He embraced her, but his boy tried to pull away. The kid stomp skated away, looking over his shoulder with wide-eyed fear. His father and the new date followed. The man barely seemed to notice his son. He just stared into the woman's eyes dreamily and allowed her to lead him around the ice. I had to admit, I understood the feeling. I couldn't say exactly what it was that made the raven-haired woman so special, but it was hard to look away from her. She twirled her date gracefully and pressed him against the rink barrier. Leaning in close, she whispered something into his ear. He lay back and closed his eyes, savoring it, like he couldn't believe his luck. Meanwhile, the boy was running out of energy. He grabbed his knees, panting, and the raven-haired woman shot across the ice toward him like a swooping owl. An expert skater, she clamped a hand over his mouth with one hand and guided him to the exit with the other. It was over before I could react, before I even realized what was going on. A sea of happy couples blocked my path to the door. The boy's father rubbed his eyes, glancing around like a man waking from sleep. Then the panic set in. He stumbled around the ice, grabbing people, asking if they'd seen his son. Kyrie tugged my hand gently, urging me to follow. But by the time we reached the packed lobby and clumsily pulled off our skates, I knew that it was already too late. The raven-haired woman and the boy were long gone. I stared, slack-jawed, at the man's babbling attempt to explain what had happened to the rink attendant. Kyrie tugged my hand again. We should go. You knew. In the snowy darkness of the parking lot, I confronted Kyrie. How? She smirked and kept walking. Hey, I shouted. That man's son could be in danger. What's going on? Like I said, you notice things. I'm confident you'll figure it out. Kyrie looked up into the cloudy night sky and sighed, an unreadable expression on her face. But first, you sound like you need a drink. I know a club downtown. XXY, read the pink and purple neon letters above the solid metal door. I'd never heard of this place, or even this street, before. But then, I hadn't been to a club since college. I really hoped Kyrie wouldn't expect me to dance. A burly white guy in a skin-tight black t-shirt nodded to Kyrie and opened a solid metal door. A feeling of foreboding filled me as I looked down the dark staircase on the other side. How much did I really know about Kyrie? Did I really want to go down there with a girl who I'd only known for a few hours? With a girl who just watched a live kidnapping and done nothing to stop it? Kyrie looked up at me with her dark, curious almond eyes. Before I knew it, we'd checked our coats and descended into XXY. With the glowing red lights, fog machine, and writhing shapes, the club reminded me of hell. The heat from so many dancing bodies made it about as warm, too. We squeezed our way through the sweaty crowd to the bar, where Kyrie gestured to a guy in a leather vest and chaps who looked like a supermodel. Moments later, he slid an old-fashioned over to me. How had she known it was my favorite drink? I reached for my wallet, but Kyrie shook her head. Do you come here often? I shouted lamely over the pounding music. Almost never. Kyrie laughed, but there's something that I want you to see. I groaned inwardly. Not again. Kyrie gently touched my wrist. She pointed to a tall, bald African man in a suit. His hollow eyes were locked on a skinny blonde guy wearing a mesh t-shirt. The college kid was clearly hopped up on the Red Bull vodka drinks that were the club's specialty, dancing his head off in the heart of the crowd. As the hollow-eyed man moved toward him, I realized that the man didn't just have a sunken face. His eye sockets were completely empty, with nothing inside of them but hungry darkness. The crowd parted for him. People seemed unconsciously repulsed by the gaunt figure, even though I had the strangest feeling that they couldn't even see him. The hollow-eyed man halted just in front of the blonde dancer, and when he did, the young man froze. In fact, everyone froze. From the bartender to the raving crowd, all their heads dropped to their chests just as though they'd fallen asleep standing up. Deafening dance music boomed from the speakers for a completely still and silent crowd. The hollow-eyed man lifted the blonde dancer's chin, their lips clamped together in a violent kiss. The dancer's throat grew swollen, bulging as the hollow-eyed man sucked the life from him. I tried to move, but couldn't. I was just as paralyzed as everyone else. It felt like an eternity before the dancer crumpled to the ground, a hollow sack of skin and bones. Beneath his mesh t-shirt, he had the starved look of a death camp victim. The hollow-eyed man scanned the room, apparently satisfied for now. To my surprise and terror, he nodded in our direction before walking, drifting, up the stairs. The metal doors slammed shut and every head in the club snapped up at once. People blinked confusedly and resumed dancing, oblivious to the grotesque sight on the floor. Kyrie took her fingers off of my wrist and gave me a look I recognized. We should go, am I all right? I suggested, unable to control the shaking in my voice. Kyrie nodded and led me upstairs through the oblivious crowd. Outside, I lost it. Okay, I don't know what this is, but it is not a date. Kyrie put a fist on her hip. I thought for sure you would have pieced everything together by now. This isn't funny. I shouted. People are getting hurt. What the hell was that thing? Come with me to one last place. Kyrie grabbed my hand with both of hers. If you still don't understand why I'm doing this, I'll tell you after. I promise. Besides, aren't you hungry? I was starving, actually. But it was after 2 a.m., and the roads were slick with ice. Where the hell was going to be open at this time of night? 30 minutes later, Kyrie watched me wolf down my syrupy waffles and cheesy hash browns with a bemused expression on her face. "So, what'd you want to shoot me at a pancake house?" I asked through a mouthful of food. "I just wanted you to eat a nice meal so you don't start feeling faint." Kyrie smirked. Don't you believe me? I shook my head. I just saw a guy get his guts sucked out like he was a goddamn crazy straw. I'm not sure what to believe anymore. Good. That means you're getting closer to the truth. Kyrie ran her fingers up my forearm. Come to the bathroom with me. What? Here. Now. I looked around incredulously. Kyrie lifted an eyebrow and guided me toward the restrooms. I blushed, sure that someone would see when Kyrie yanked me by the collar through the door of the men's restroom. There was no one standing at the 3 sticky urinals or sitting in either of the 2 stalls. No one who I could see, anyway. Kyrie took me into the smaller stall, locked the door, then pulled me up so we were both standing on the toilet lid. There was barely enough room on the white plastic for both of us. I could feel our chests pressed together, her fingers on my back. The restroom door flew open and a guy in dirty black boots staggered in. Dumb slut. He moaned to himself as he struggled to find his zipper. I spent like $30 on her tonight. She owes me. Through the crack in the stall door, I could see where the drunk braced himself against a urinal. It was Johnny. From where he stood, pissing, he couldn't see the pale, naked, genderless figure that was crawling out of the ceiling tile and down the wall. Kyrie covered my mouth a split second before I screamed. The pale thing approached Johnny silently from behind until its gnarled toes were practically touching his heels. Oblivious, Johnny zipped up. But before he could turn around, the pale thing stepped into him. Johnny's clothes and skin yielded like foam as it slipped on his flesh like a pajama onesie. His face shifted from shock to agony and finally to horror before finally settling into an expression of featureless calm. The new Johnny paused in front of the mirror, trying out his hands and fingers like stiff new gloves. Those hands combed apart into Johnny's usually unruly hair, then caressed his chest with the glee of a long-caged animal finally set free. Every trace of drunkenness was gone. The door slammed shut as a shiny new Johnny left the restroom with swift, professional strides. What the fuck? I mouthed to Kyrie. She jumped gracefully down from the toilet, unlocked the door, and motioned for me to follow. There's things like that everywhere, aren't there? I stammered. We just don't notice them. Especially tonight. Kyrie nodded. All the eager couples, the first dates, the hookups, the alcohol and loneliness. Valentine's Day is a feast day for creatures like these. You said that there was nothing worse than being alone on Valentine's Day. I wanted to show you that you were wrong and to protect you if you did go out. But why? When you yelled at Johnny that night, I could tell that you'd lost someone special to addiction. Kyrie rolled up her long sleeves. The track marks were too obvious. I couldn't stop myself from reaching out to touch them. I did too, Kyrie went on. Myself. 2 horrible truths struck me at once. There was no pulse in the veins beneath my fingertips, and, according to the mirror across from us, I was alone in the men's room. I was already on my way out from an OD when my sire sunk her fangs into my neck. It's a shame. If we'd met when I was still alive, we might have been very happy together. I backed away until my back pressed against the cold tile wall. I hope you heed my warning when I tell you to hurry home, and that you remember this lesson for next year. Kyrie smiled. The night is young, you see, and I still need to feed. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.